Death is an inevitable phenomenon in life, and we hear about it every day because every day people die. Not just people though. Everything in this world has an end. Trees, cats, even your favorite dog will one day draw its last breath. But to humans, the death of a loved one, whether a person, a pet, an era, or even death in itself can be painful, or even in most cases, fearful. Death is the norm of life. Day in, day out, a life is lost and a fresh one is gained. So if death is an inevitable experience, why should it be legalized? Death is natural. No matter how painful and inevitable it is, one thing is for sure, almost everyone would like to go peacefully. But this is not always the case, because we also know there are many cruel ways people exit this life. But even with that, why do you think assisted dying is right or wrong? How do you feel about hastening the death of someone facing intractable pain and given a few months to live? Or what if this person in pain wants to die and end the pain? What if he wants to end it all now? What if it's better that way? Would it be bearable watching a loved one endure pain until their last breath, or it would be best to let them go when they want to? Is it also best for medical practitioners to do away with the traditional system of healthcare maintenance and accept their limitations by facilitating death when requested? Let's switch it up. What if that was you and not your relative or loved one? What decision will you make? What will you do? What are your thoughts? Let that sink in. Are you done thinking about it? Perhaps you disagree because of your religious beliefs, or you are probably thinking that this is wrong because it disrupts the natural order of things. Or to you, this sounds much like suicide, but in as much as it sounds that way, assisted dying is very different. First things first, suicide is defined as when you end your own life to end pain or suffering or whatever is pestering you. So going by that definition, assisted suicide should be a form of suicide, right? Assisted suicide then is when someone helps another person to kill themselves. You should note that suicide is not the same as assisted dying, and in as much as assisted suicide sounds much like assisted dying, it is still not the same. Assisted dying is used to describe an instance where a terminally ill, mentally competent adult is assisted with lethal drugs which they can then self-administer. Notice how I use the words terminally ill, mentally competent adult? Yeah, exactly. It could also be when a doctor indirectly performs a lethal act, assisting a patient to end their own life. The term is known differently around the world, and they stem from the historical reason or reasons behind it, or even it describes how it is administered. And so by that, assisted dying can take the form of euthanasia as known in the Netherlands, assisted suicide as known in countries like Switzerland, physician-assisted suicide as known in countries like Belgium, assisted dying as it is known in Australia, death with dignity as known in America, or medical aid dying as known in Canada. The distinction among the various terms used for assisted dying is based on whether or not the action is induced as the patient is already actively dying, and so the action is just to hasten the dying process, or if the person has a terminal illness, or the assistance was granted based on the level of severity of the patient's suffering. The procedure of assisted dying and its terms may sound a bit confusing, especially when some contain the term suicide, right? Let me explain. Most of the time when someone commits suicide, or if they are considering suicide, the decision to end life is mainly due to a feeling of hopelessness, while the medical assisted dying is motivated by hope and autonomy. What do I mean by that? I mean death by suicide is not medically aided or assisted by a medical practitioner. For instance, even if you aren't feeling hopeless but are terminally ill and just want to end the pain by ending your life, it is still considered suicide. If you help a terminally ill person to take their life without the recommendation from a medical practitioner, that is assisted suicide, and you can be held liable for the act. However, with assisted dying, you, or the person who is terminally ill, choose to end their suffering, which in most instances is intolerable, and have the assistance of medical professionals to do so. In this case, they use life-ending medications prescribed by the medical practitioner, or through direct IV, which will facilitate their death. And in most of these instances, the prescribing clinician is present. When you or a loved one, unfortunately, needs to be assisted to end their life, though it is sad, yet it is a much more peaceful and planned way to die as compared to suicide. And family and friends are included in the planning process. and so have the chance to say their final goodbyes before the person walks the green mile. But what do you hear of a suicide? You hear it just right out of the blue, right? Exactly. Suicide is mostly done in isolation, and mostly through violent acts which I need not mention. As assisted dying will help family members and close ones accept the circumstances and feel a bit okay because of the process that takes place before the death occurs. Suicide, on the other hand, leaves the family and loved ones in distress. Moreover, suicide is a criminal act, and assisting someone to commit suicide is an even more criminal activity. According to the American Association for Suicidology, there are some main differences in the circumstances of death that differentiate suicide from assisted dying. When you or someone you know is suffering from a terminal illness, the decision for the assisted dying can come not because they want to die, but because they have a terminal illness, and so their death is close. There's nothing more fearful than knowing the Grim Reaper is breathing down your neck. You might as well exit on your own terms. Though it would not be very natural to die through assisted dying, it, however, draws your death closer than waiting and suffering. In this way, you have a much easier and less painful way to die. And also, you get to die according to your wishes and values. This is much different from suicide because with suicide, there is self-destruction and involves very painful processes and unspeakable acts. It might sound surprising, but suicide cuts life shorter than assisted dying does. Another thing you can identify with assisted dying is that you, the patient, are never alone. Let's say your friend or a family member is following through with assisted dying. What happens is that, once you know the person will be leaving soon, you make sure you spend as much quality time you can with them and make them feel loved. Why though? Because you are going to miss them, and you want to be there with them, even in their final moments. Plus, you want them to have a good time in their final moments. But as you may know, suicides are never the same. As said earlier, people who die by suicide do so in isolation. This means that they are alone when they die. Take a moment to imagine what goes through their mind. Probably the fear and regret after the ball has been set into motion. It is crazy the stories suicide survivors tell about what was going through their mind after the act itself had been started. The trauma, it is indeed crazy. One thing you should know about suicide is that it is very common among people with mental health conditions and is mostly the outcome of impaired thinking, cognitive distortion, impaired problem solving, agitation, anxiety, personality disorder, and hopelessness. You may be thinking that, what if the person does have a terminal illness, but is having all of these thoughts which result in suicidal thoughts? In that case, the person would have to be examined by a medical practitioner to be sure that the person's decision to end their life is not a result of mental conditions or even depression. Assisted dying can be termed as end-of-life options or death with dignity. And so dying by this method is not recorded as suicide on the death certificate, but is rather recorded as death from the underlying terminal condition. It is distinctly different from suicide because death by suicide is recorded just as it is, and it incurs substantial forensic costs as a result of the amount of medical documentation required during the investigation processes. When someone dies through assisted dying, the impact of the loss is much less severe than with other deaths, because they would be aware of the death and would have made all the preparations to be able to cope with the loss.